Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for choosing to come here to the lecture today at 5:30, in spite of the great pressure for you to be elsewhere. Welcome to the 16th Geo Lecture Series. This is the last one for the year 2023, and this is brought to you by the Philippine Geographical Society in partnership with the UP Department of Geography, and this is part of the 40th anniversary celebration of the UP Department of Geography. I am Joseph Palis, and I'll be your moderator for this lecture. Just a few reminders before we proceed. Kindly keep your microphones on mute during presentation. We encourage you to interact by typing your comments and questions in the chat box. They will be addressed during the open forum. Also, please note that this meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be made available for viewing after the event or maybe next week. Through the Department of Geography YouTube channel, and subscribe to our channel as well, so to know more about the other details. At this point, let me introduce to you the first president of the Philippine Geographical Society to give his opening remarks, Professor Emmanuel Garcia.
Thank you, Sir Joe. A pleasant afternoon to everyone. I am delighted to welcome all to our 16th Geo Lecture for 2023, also the last one for this year. This is brought to us by the partnership of the Philippine Geographical Society and the UP Department of Geography. This presentation puts into perspectives how the Philippines as a labor exporting nation dealt with the uncertainty during the pandemic and the global organizing efforts of Filipino nurses and organizations amidst the rise in anti-Asian violence during the pandemic. In line with this, I am happy to share with you the word cloud generated from our registration keywords. Dominant words include love, concern, empathy, nurture, protect, considerate, and I am excited to see how this all fits in this afternoon's lecture. So for the last time this year, maraming salamat po sa patuloy na pagsama sa aming Geo. And on behalf of the Philippine Geographical Society and the UP Department of Geography, welcome to the 16th Geo Lecture for 2023.
Allow me to introduce our invited speaker for this lecture. Edward Nadurata is a PhD student in Global and International Studies with designated emphasis in medical humanities and Asian American studies at the University of California at Irvine. He is currently an ACLS Mellon dissertation innovation fellow and a visiting fellow in the Third World Studies Center at UP Diliman. His research lies on the intersections of retirement, care work, aging, globalization, disability studies, and of course, Filipino studies. He received his Master of Arts in Asian American Studies from UCLA and serves as editorial assistant for ALON. It's a journal for Filipinekis, American, and diasporic studies, the online open access journal of the Bulusan Center for Filipino Studies at University of California, Davis, and the Journal of Asian American Studies. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you our speaker, Edward Nadurata. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone. Hello, good afternoon there in the Philippines. I just want to thank you all for coming to this talk today. I'll be reading, and my paper is down here, so if I'm looking weirdly, it's because of that. But I know that there's a lot of other pressures and other events to go to today, so I appreciate you all being here. But I also just want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Joseph Palis, who invited me. And I actually met during my first year as a PhD student when he did our colloquium talk at UCI during the pandemic. And the staff in the Department of Geography at UP Diliman and the Philippine Geographical Society who made today possible. I also want to thank the San Francisco-based artist Kimberly Acebo Arteche for allowing us to use an image from her photo series Bodiless to grace the promotional materials for this talk this afternoon. I'm currently zooming in from Tongvaland or Los Angeles, California, a place that I've considered home for most of my life. And in doing this small land acknowledgement, I'm recognizing my place here in the United States as a settler, but also the importance of knowing about space and place, especially in relation to our lives. I think very pertinent, especially given the talk in the geography department, right? And also as a background for this work, this very much is the backdrop for my research in the Philippines on aging, retirement, and care. But this work was largely developed as I started my doctoral program in the fall of 2020 when the pandemic started. These are reflections that were also largely influenced by the fact that I was also and still am providing care for my grand aunt when I'm here in Los Angeles. So with that being said, I'll get started. Can I just get that thumbs up that y'all are seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes, we're seeing it, sir.
Thank you. The image on the poster, a part of this photo series, Bodiless by Kim Arteche, shows a duster, a common piece of clothing that is worn by Filipinas. Maybe your mother, your lola, an aunt, or yourself. Suspended and without a body occupying the article of clothing, Arteche explores personal and global narratives of Filipino bodies and their physical and emotional labor, unquote, seeing parallels between her experience as a Filipina in the arts as a, quote, colorful figure amongst white space, a body seen but whose voice is not heard or validated, unquote. A body seen but whose voice is not heard or validated. The resonance of this photo series and this phrase of body seen but whose voice is not heard or validated has remained a poignant reminder, at least for me, about the experiences of many Filipinos, especially those in the care industry during the past few years of this global pandemic. This non-presence of the Filipino body amidst its ubiquity in the care industry globally is, of course, nothing new. This position of Filipinos in the global care economy, of course, is not by any accident. As an American colony, and these are other images from the photo series. There's another one. But this position of Filipinos in the global care economy, of course, it's not by any accident. As an American colony from 1848 to 1946, education and health were used as avenues for the benevolent assimilation campaigns of the Americans to pacify and modernize their newly conquered little brown brothers. Scholars like Warwick Anderson and Catherine Siniza Choi have highlighted this history of the American occupation in the Philippines. The Filipino body was constructed as weak, diseased, and therefore racially inferior. And it was only through American tutelage that Filipinos would ever be capable of attaining their sovereignty and be fit for self-rule. The emphasis on reforming the Filipino in terms of their health and hygiene became the impetus for Americans to turn to nursing as a way to educate their colonial subjects in proper health practices. As part of their medical education agenda in the Philippines, American colonial officials first recruited Filipino women from elite families to educate them as nurses. This training in nursing allowed Filipinos to acquire skills that were commensurate to American standards of healthcare, that when coupled with their knowledge of the English language and the cultivation of America as the land of opportunity, resulted in Filipinos being an obvious answer for the labor needs of the United States and globally. These, Catherine Choi argues, would lay the foundation for Filipino nurse mass migrations overseas in the second half of the 20th century. This global presence of Filipino nurses, however, cannot just be explained by American colonialism, but is also tied to the development of the Philippine economy in the second half of the 20th century. The structural adjustment policies demanded by institutions like the International Monetary Fund in exchange for loans resulted in disinvestment in social spending and transformed the country to an export-oriented economy with its own citizens as their primary product. This was facilitated by the development of the Philippines into what Robin Rodriguez calls a labor brokerage state, in which the state itself is involved in the training and marketing of its people and the regulation of the labor export industry itself. The Philippine state capitalizes on its own people, coordinates with other nations who are looking for laborers in hopes of facilitating and controlling the process by which labor migrants are able to migrate abroad. So much so that, as Martin Manalansan argues, Filipinos have been seen as synonymous with the care industry across the world. What decades of outmigration of healthcare workers from the Philippines and the resulting poor healthcare infrastructure due to underinvestment does is to ostensibly create what the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore has termed as organized abandonment due to manufacture permanent crisis in order for racial capitalism to survive and thrive at the expense of Filipinos globally, that is further masked by the Filipino body's propensity to care. So just as the lockdowns in the pandemic came out of nowhere, in an instant, the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, an arm of the labor brokerage state, signed an order on April 2, 2020, that restricted medical frontliners from leaving the country until the state of emergency because of COVID-19 was lifted. This ban included not only medical doctors and nurses, but also microbiologists, molecular biologists, X-ray and respiratory technicians, therapists, pharmacists, and other crucial personnel in order to have enough manpower for the country's health infrastructure to actually function. This ban, however, was met with much uproar and opposition from many healthcare workers who were waiting for their deployment abroad. Many cited poor working conditions and low pay as main reasons for wanting to move out of the country, despite the pandemic, which ultimately led then Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte to relax the travel ban in November of 2020 and allow up to 5,000 Filipinos to migrate abroad. Seemingly faced with the predicament to vaccinate 70 million adults in the country, as they failed to secure vaccines from global companies like Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer, the Philippine government in 2021 offered to allow thousands of healthcare workers, mostly nurses, to migrate to Europe for work if countries like the United Kingdom and Germany agreed to donate vaccines to the country, which at that point of the pandemic had the most cases in Southeast Asia. This reliance on Filipino nurses, however, is not just limited to the Philippine state. Having to deal with medical workers unwilling to get vaccinated or to go back to work, American cities facing labor shortages like Detroit and Syracuse again look towards the Philippines for workers eager to make higher wages and to work abroad. Those who refused the vaccine mandate were to be replaced with Filipino workers who were ready anytime to fill in the ranks of those in the front lines, whether seen as a source of remittances, a bargaining chip for vaccines, or the answer to the labor shortages created by those unwilling to get vaccinated. What these moments in the past 3 years show is the disposability of Filipino nurses in the global economy as subjects of racial capitalism. While the pandemic seemingly forced so many people into a new normal, Filipino healthcare professionals found themselves in rather familiar situations, being in the front lines of disease and contagion. Given this, and also this tweet, which was before the pandemic, I kind of want to entertain and think with a tweet from 2018 from the Filipino-American psychologist E.J.R. David, who tweeted, "There are 15 seasons of Grey's Anatomy based in freaking Seattle, where Filipinos are everywhere and Filipino nurses dominate, and the show never had one Filipino nurse. Hashtag Forgotten Asian Americans, hashtag Brown Asian, hashtag Emmys 2018. Considering the huge population of Filipinos in Seattle, which according to the Pew Research Center in 2017 had 101,000 Filipinos, it is indeed peculiar to think about the lack of Filipino representation in the show. However, spoiler alert, 2 years after this 2018 tweet and amidst the global pandemic, Grey's Anatomy finally had a Filipino nurse in the 17th season of the show. While one might think that this casting would be for a Filipino nurse next to Meredith Grey fighting in the front lines, the nurse, named Girlie Bernardo, is instead on a hospital bed, suffering from the repercussions of contracting the disease, showing the darker side of the frontliner images that were promulgated in 2020. As a nurse who had been working at an assisted living facility for 7 years, Girlie, who was played by Aina Dumlao, contracted COVID-19 from her patient named Earl. Even though she was just on a ventilator, Gurley had recovered and was eager to go back to work and to take care of Earl. However, as she was waiting to get picked up outside the hospital and met Meredith Grey, the titular character of the show, she passes out after telling Meredith that she was a nurse and can therefore not rest. As the story progresses and she lies in the ICU, Dr. Meredith Grey is on the quest to save Gurley, advocating for her to go under a double lung transplant, a risky procedure that other doctors did not find to be the right avenue. While Gurley remained unresponsive, the COVID-19 vaccines were finally rolled out, and the staff of the Grey Sloan Memorial Hospital were finally able to get their first doses. Luckily, other doctors were convinced, and Gurley undergoes a successful double lung transplant and lives. I think it's also important to point out that I believe that the first person to get the vaccine, one of the first people, frontliners, was a Filipina in the UK. So that's another interesting point. So while this question of representation in a major Hollywood TV show may be trivial or frivolous for some, maybe because of its relationship to possible empty calls for recognition under a rubric of neoliberal multiculturalism and inclusion or diversity in the United States, I bring this example up to highlight the importance of thinking with risk and contagion to understand our legibility in our global condition. It is definitely curious, at least for me, that it is during the pandemic that a Filipino nurse becomes part of the show. But what I want to ask is, what might thinking with contagion highlight differently than our usual questions about labor, diaspora, presence, and representation? On May 2020, the transnational feminist organization AFFIRM, short for the Association of Feminists Fighting Fascism, Imperialism, Refeudalization, and Marginalization, launched Kanlungan, which loosely translates to shelter or resting place in Filipino, according to their website, in honor of healthcare workers of Filipino descent globally who had fallen to COVID-19. AFFIRM cites that while Filipino nurses in California made up 1 in 5 nurses, that 1 in 4 Filipinos in the New York and New Jersey area worked in the healthcare sector, and 34.4% of internationally trained nurses in Canada were of Filipino descent. Those who had fallen to the disease were not memorialized. For the organization, it was important not only to name these Filipino healthcare workers, but to remember them as, quote, human beings, not simply as a labor percentage, a disease statistic, or an immigration number, unquote. As a crowdsourced project led by a community organization, Kanlungan encourages those in the Filipino community to contribute stories and information on their family members or community members who died from COVID-19. Volunteers in the organization also search for information on fallen Filipino workers globally through social media, posts on Facebook, or news articles that documented deaths in the community. At the same time, they also searched in the internet for GoFundMes and other crowdsourcing fundraising campaigns for fallen workers. A gallery with photos and information about the departed are compiled so that the departed are memorialized. The information that is contributed to the website is then transferred into an interactive Google Maps interface, which I have here on the slide, with each location marked by a red tag, highlighting the global dimension of the effects of COVID-19 to the Philippines and its diaspora. These red tags appear in the usual places, where one would think a Filipino would migrate: the United States, Canada, the UK, the Middle East. In highlighting the vastness of the Filipino diaspora, what this project ultimately shows in the red tags are where the migrant dies, where migrants are in constant risk and are always proximate to the contagion. In the way Filipinos are seen globally to have the propensity to care, what the past 3 years have highlighted is how under global racial capitalism, Filipinos occupy spaces that are always proximate to risk, making sure that healthcare systems in the global north are propped up and resourced by our labor, while also creating the organized abandonment of our communities, whether in the diaspora or at home. As one of my main points for this presentation, I want to explore with you all the import of racial capitalism as a concept to examine the global Filipino condition. And I acknowledge that I've been mentioning the word, so now I'll go into it. Racial capitalism is a concept that was actually coined by South African activists who were organizing and articulating their understanding of South African apartheid and the ways that racism and capitalism intersected in their lived experiences. Academically, however, racial capitalism is famously attributed to Cedric Robinson, who, while sparse in providing a direct definition of racial capitalism, demonstrates in his book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, the racist roots and routes of capitalism through a historical study of its development from Europe onwards. Robinson shows that feudalism in Europe, that which was upended by capitalist relations, did not turn racist with its encounter with Africans and those outside Europe, but actually has always had racial dimensions, even within the continent, as profit and accumulation always necessitated difference-making and a form of the other to be dispossessed and exploited. Similarly, the ethnic studies scholar Jody Malamed, in her essay entitled Racial Capitalism, points out that, quote, accumulation requires loss, disposability, and the unequal differentiation of human value and racism that enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires. As shown by the history of Filipino dominance in the global care industry, I argue that it is then crucial to think about race and class as mutually constitutive phenomena. As a global project, racial capitalism and difference-making become central to the organization of the modern world order. However, in these intricacies of the production of difference, we see how different processes become used to subjugate myriad groups of people globally. Following Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism as a state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death, and it's specifically in this essay, which was republished in Abolitionist Geographies, that has this ending phrase, in distinct yet interconnected political geographies. The way that various global communities are made vulnerable through difference-making allows us to see connections that highlight the mutual subjugation that create the possibilities for the flourishing of capital for the lives of those who are valued more and at the expense of those who are considered surplus, disposable, exploitable, or what I see here as those who can be proximate to risk or contagion. Amidst these differentiations is their subsumption under the same global racial capital logic, which ostensibly allows them to be read together as relational social formations. The task at hand for me then, and I argue, is exactly this: to connect lines amidst different geographies and thinking with racism and capitalism as connected, not as discrete categories of analysis. For the case of the Philippines, for example, we can make these connections with the way that Americans brought their military personnel during American colonialism, who were actually serving during the Indian Wars to eradicate the native populations here in the United States, or even the ways that Filipinos were read simultaneously as indigenous, native, or Black, in the way that Filipinos were being understood racially when the Americans came, or even how American colonial officials like Governor General William Cameron Forbes, for example, was then later sent to Haiti to deal with the rebellions there and how to solve that issue. There's a new book now that just came out from the University of North Carolina Press called Bundok, A Hinterland History of Filipino America by Adrian De Leon, and he actually looks at the importance of the northern part of the Philippines in the development of Filipino America, and how region is something that's important to think about. One of the chapters is looking at the Hawaiian sugar plantation workers association that recruited mainly Ilocanos to go to Hawaii, and kind of thinking about that difference making in relation to the nation state that we know now as the Philippines. So focusing on risk and exposure, I argue, go beyond the usual models of race that are rooted in more identitarian logics that are based in nation-state formations. Because by focusing on risk and exposure, it necessitates us to center racial capitalism in our analysis. As both global processes, racism and capitalism, or the more apt term racial capitalism, allows us to cohere a global diaspora like the Filipino people under the same rubric, but further allows us to trace known and surprising connections between the usage of Filipino labor as an easy labor source during times of crises to forms of dispossession and exploitation that are crucial to the global world order. So as the pandemic progressed, nurses in parts of the Philippines, to their union Nurses United, decided to take matters into their own hands and protested in the streets of Manila against the delay of promised hazard pay and the special risk allowance promised by the government, along with the poor working conditions they were forced to work in. This constant exposure to the contagion that is COVID-19 resulted in many Filipino frontliners dying in the Philippines as well, because many found themselves without adequate, proper personal protective equipment to shield them from the virus. Acutely aware of the realities that Filipino medical workers face, Nurses United decided to apply for candidacy as a party list for the past May 2022 elections. This decision for Filipino Nurses United to apply for candidacy is an example of Filipino nurses articulating themselves based on their identity as those in the nursing profession and their mission to address the health needs of the nation at large. The party list cites that what triggered their decision to run was their woeful work conditions that have triggered the exodus of nurses to seek for better opportunities in foreign lands, which is only exacerbated these past years as they face lack of personal protective equipment, low salaries, no allowances, benefits, lack of job security, and low morale. Despite this, however, for them, they still rose to the challenge and held true to their oath to protect and save lives. As a marginalized labor sector, Filipino nurses organize and are still organizing themselves to articulate their participation in Philippine politics and society to their identity as frontline workers and healthcare professionals affected by government mismanagement during the pandemic. Through their experience with the pandemic, Filipino nurses and other medical laborers are understanding themselves as a sector in Philippine society that can make change in the daily lives of Filipinos through the interventions they propose in Philippine healthcare, including their call for a, quote, a healthcare system that is free, comprehensive, tax-funded, integrated, and equitable, unquote. This, for me, is a manifestation of a form of civic participation or citizenship that cannot be removed from their proximity to contagion and COVID-19. Just to conclude, in the spirit of, in the article by Jody Melamed called "The Spirit of Neoliberalism: From Racial Liberalism to Neoliberal Multiculturalism," she asked in her concluding paragraph, will the new race radicalism capture racial reference affirmatively enough to discredit neoliberalism's appropriation of U.S. multiculturalism and to diminish its version of a just global order? Gesturing towards the emergence of a new, quote, race radicalism, Melamed opens a conversation for speculation. How are we to end our current global order that is based on the global project of racial capitalism? The organized abandonment that we now find as the condition of the Philippines has not only been possible through racial capitalism. The crumbling infrastructure that the country saw when the lockdowns began in 2020, the failure to secure enough vaccines early during its onset, the need to balance the outmigration and forced permanence of its healthcare workers just to ensure the continuous functioning of the country's medical industry, or what has been the effects of what has now been almost 50 years of continued labor exploitation and lack of investment in its own people. To understand the global condition of the Philippines and Filipinos in this vein highlights how our experiences as a global population are only possible as those that must be subjugated and put under the threat of risk and contagion. While we understand our experiences now under the guise of labor, migration, and the modes of production that has allowed our presence globally, in taking up racial capitalism as an analytic, we instead can read the past 2 years in terms of the modes of relations that form when we read our experiences as connected under the same global order. Seeing these connections highlight the possibilities that open up when tracing our work against racial capitalism and towards race radical futures, attentive not only to global inequalities, but to the possible coalitions and futures that can be made with others who are also exploited, dispossessed, and marginalized globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edward. Uh, I wanted to say something, but nothing comes out of me. I was gobsmacked by some of the empirical data as well as the visual representations that you showed, not just in newspapers during that time, but also some of the tweets that somehow look at the underrepresentation of Filipinos. We were probably a bit too cocooned by what was happening during the pandemic, that we were pretty much into how to get out of that tunnel that we are all in, to pay attention to this. But thank you very much for bringing this to our attention. We'll be proceeding with the open forum. And for those of you who are in the audience, you may use the Zoom chat box to type your questions or comments, or you may raise your hand in a way to be acknowledged before you can directly ask your question to the speakers. Maybe I'll begin. I'll begin the question. I like the deployment of Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism to understand or to map out the vulnerabilities of bodies of Filipino care care health workers, both in the Philippines actually, and also in diaspora, and how the lack of attention given to people who are actually doing frontline service to the people have been swept under the rug and not given as much recognition. In a way, it's justifiable because a lot of people were experiencing this pandemic for the first time, and therefore don't have any roadmaps to get out of that situation. But at the same time, it is very telling of how much marginalized and dispossessed some of our brothers and sisters who are out there working to prop up the global north economies. And that to me has always been, in a way, it's kind of a maybe a response to your question about Malabed's provocation about how to undo this the racial capitalism that has been spread out to us by the global order, especially the United States. If there was a question, there was a film before I remembered. I think it was 2004. If I'm not mistaken. It was a documentary called A Day Without a Mexican, and they made it into a feature-length film. It wasn't really good, the other one, but the documentary was really powerful. And they were saying something about how much of the labor force of Latinos in the United States, especially Mexicans, in the United States, have propped up most of the 3D jobs, right? The dirty, dangerous, difficult type of jobs that were done by these people. And if there is a kind of a radical thorough line where people could come together and actually maybe abandon their jobs, it would maybe collapse some of it. And in 2005, I was in Chicago with Dr. Darlene Gutierrez attending the American Association of Geographers. And during one of those happy hours, we were surprised that no one was actually serving us, because that was the great walkout that started in 2005, where most of those mostly Latino population walked out of the jobs, and we suddenly found ourselves unable to do anything. It was very powerful, very effective, and we, in solidarity of that, we also walked out, right? We did pay, but we just wanted to make sure we paid for our drinks, and then we left as a way of solidarity. But others were not as attentive to it, because probably they were so deep into the happy hour thing, and also because maybe the sympathy wasn't as much strong as as we thought there would be. But that's kind of an example wherein there can be a space for such kinds of collaboration and in solidarity of workers together, um, to maybe show that without their emotional labor involved, as well as the grueling physical labor that in that's often not talked about, can actually show how much proportionately dependent some of these nations are to Filipino labor. So
No,
thank
I
you
think
for being,
yeah,
yeah.
I think that's a good point. I think I've been hearing a lot recently too of I think with what's been happening the past 2 months, really a lot of especially youth being galvanized by the politics and the connections globally, what's happening in the Middle East, in Palestine, to the Congo, to Hawaii, you know, to West Papua, that all these things are all connected. Be, in the search for profit, but also in the subjugation of like marginalized populations globally. And um, as I'm thinking about the world, I always think how I'm related. I have family members all over. I can go to Australia, I can go to Canada, the UK, what have you. And the reason why I ended up thinking more with racial capitalism too was at a conference where somebody was like, it was the Asian American Studies Association, and Canadians also come and they go, oh, you're a Filipino American, so it's so much more easier for you to actually talk about your work or contextualize it, because you can talk about empire, you can talk about American empire, but I'm a Canadian, like what do I say? Or me, and I was, and that got me actually questioning, like what connects the disparate populations of Filipinos globally. um and for me, I think racial capitalism is one avenue to connect all of us, because we are all over the place, right? They just evacuated Filipinos in Israel, and also Filipino Palestinian families recently, back to the Philippines, and there's actually a lot of crowdsourcing for them as well right now. So yeah, no, thank you for that point, because I think solidarity doesn't necessarily come easy, but we can find solidarity in thinking about different marginalization or different processes of subjugation.
Absolutely. There were members of Doctors Without Borders who recently came to, there was a talk that they gave at UP Manila, and there were Filipino doctors who were there, belonging to the Doctors Without Borders, who were also saying pretty much the same thing. This was in the context of, they were based in Gaza. And so they were talking about their own experiences also, that providing healthcare is paramount to what they're doing. That's the reason why they were there. And it 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 seems like their commitment to helping people who are wounded also stems from that kind of solidarity. Actually, when they said like we're all, there was this one thing that one doctor said that really touched me quite deeply, actually, now that I think of it, where he said something like, there was one person who was wounded when he was telling the story, and he was so jaded about it because they're doing all sorts of things, open wounds and putting people together, stitching them back, and then the patient, he didn't specify where a patient comes from, but he just said, I'm wounded, doctor, will you let me live, or something to that effect. And he just said, we should band together, we're people of color. And that's the first thing he said, and it was just such a, I don't know, such a beautiful moment to say, for a medical doctor talking to someone on the brink of death, and instead of giving some empty platitudes about, you're gonna live, you're in good hands, but more like, as person of color, we should help each other.
Mhm.
That kind of really was I don't know which, of course I know which political line he was the stands that he was
Mm.
um, supporting, but I could almost imagine that he feels the ridiculousness of what's going on, and just wanting to help bring these people out, as much as
Mhm.
possible. But it just had the effect of hitting, pulling at my emotional heartstrings, and just
Yeah,
just kind of resonated so much. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Are there any other questions or comments? It doesn't have to be a question. It can also be a comment. Let's keep it care related, not basketball related. Yes. Yes, Duan. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sir Joseph. Congratulations, by the way, Edward, for a very touching and emotional presentation. I really appreciate it. Mine is not really a question. Oh, well, it is a question, but it stems from a recent experience because I just came back from Australia. And when I was there, I was able to talk to some Filipinos there. And of course, I'm sure, as with other global North countries, you would hear the stories of Filipino medical workers. So in this case, there were many stories about nurses in the Philippines or professionals in the Philippines migrating to these global North countries to work as medical care workers. But one of their stories, or one aspect of their stories, was some of these nurses, when they, or even doctors, when they go to these countries, they are required to take exams, and if they don't pass the exam, they are relegated to do other types of medical work that are not necessarily what they were dreaming about or targeting or thinking of. So my question now is, have you also considered the policies of the receiving countries and how it impacts the experiences of these workers? Because we know that in the Philippines, we have these economic policies that actually encourages this outward movement of professionals. But how about the receiving countries? And yeah, as I've said, how do they affect the experiences of our medical workers?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. Definitely. And very relevant. I think being based in the United States and growing up here, and as an immigrant myself, I moved here when I was 10, 11. I would always hear like, oh, mas bukas sa America. Like, oh, it's like madaling pumunta ng America ngayon, or different countries, right? And even now in social media, I keep on seeing things about Australia, actually. People like how to get to Australia. But in terms of policies and in relation to my work, I've thought about it in two ways. One, um, really the mass recruitment of Filipino nurses too started, some actually point it as starting during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, when they didn't have, enough um nurse labor to actually care for these patients dying of what was then an unknown disease, and Filipinos would be in the front lines care, you know giving care. And there's another paper that I've written where they've actually interviewed people who, they were like, this actually reminds me of when I first came to the US, when I was attending to when it was the AIDS pandemic, and now it's COVID and it's new. But again, very normal. And my work is really, this is the kind of the background for my work. I'm really interested about how organized abandonment and how these policies really affect, conditions in the Philippines and here. But in relation to aging and care, I think about a lot about the disinvestment in social welfare. Social security is always being threatened to be cut in the global north, and it actually fuels a lot of global north people to think about retiring in the Philippines. So much so that the Philippine Retirement Authority has a special resident retiree visa, that if you have enough capital, you can actually go to the Philippines and you can bypass the immigration laws, but you're like a special resident. And as you can imagine, if there's already a care crisis in the Philippines, how are we actually propping up ourselves as a place where people should retire? Because I mean, I was there in the Philippines for 3 months. I'm about to go back actually in 2 days to continue my fieldwork. And when I'm reading the news, it's always like Filipinos always want to leave, like because of mababa yung sweldo, mas maganda yung sweldo sa the usual things, right? So to me, it's interesting that we're actually investing. We're investing, or we're propping ourselves up as a retirement destination. Bongbong Marcos was in the United States a few months ago saying to Filipino Americans, you know what, like we're actually really invested in the Philippines. Like we want more of you guys to come back and retire there. Like think about it as a destination. But in my head too, I'm like, well, like how are we actually developing the country? But at the same time, like aging is expensive in the global north. So actually there's people, I have friends who are older, they're talking to their financial advisors, and they actually ask them, have you considered retiring somewhere else? And usually, it's Thailand, it's the Philippines, it's the usual countries that you think have a connection to the global north somehow. But no, I think I should really pay attention to just the policies, because I think, it's always there's like a local global thing going on, that it's not happening in a vacuum. Just gotta
It's the
Thank
first
you,
time
Edward.
it's the
Thank
first
you
time
so
I
much for the
heard of
question.
that about the retirees though. That's a very interesting development. Um, I'd like to hear more about it as it develops, I guess. Um, and again, interesting that they would there's this concept of aging gracefully, and one of my colleagues in CSSP here in UP actually was talking about that in relation to of course the aging gracefully can be very different culturally speaking, but the context of the Philippines is about still being you have agency, you still can do decisions for yourself, and being given available options.
Mm,
And she warned though that in her presentation, at least in the because this was in the Philippines, that it's not really there, because her study was really among aging Filipinos in Kyoto. And so that much was taken care of. But then there's always this desire by some of those retirees to come back to the Philippines, maybe to just spend a few days or maybe longer, but not to stay for the entire time, arguing that they can age gracefully in Japan than in the Philippines, but would still need that kind of connection with the Philippines. So that's kind of
mm.
a different narrative in some ways. And I wonder if, I don't know, if your research will also go into that in the future. That would be nice to look into
Yeah.
also the aging
What what
gracefully, or yeah.
what got me into aging actually, and maybe this is a genealogy of my own thinking. When I was a bachelor student, undergraduate at UC San Diego, I needed an honors project. And I was like, what can I talk about? And my grandparents were actually petitioned to move to the United States. And so when they came, I was like, oh my God, every time I go to the airport, there's always trains of wheelchairs of Filipinos coming. And to me, it was like, oh no, duh. Like let me think, like me let me think about like aging migrants. So it was actually became part of my master's thesis. Um, and and really I actually got to my project about aging in the Philippines because my grandparents, especially my grandfather, he said, I can't live in the United States. Like after 8 months, he went home and refused, and he said, it's like, like maybe in I think in a way, like he cannot age gracefully, in Los Angeles. In Manila, he can drive, he knows where to go, he knows maybe it's generational thing, but it prompted me to actually really think about aging. Why in migration we focus so much on going here, that we can talk about migration in a different way if you think about people that stay or refuse to leave. Like as exactly what you're saying, because migration is such a hard thing to do, so why would you do it when you're 65? And it's interesting actually, for example, in Australia they have this thing called the last remaining relative, where you can petition somebody to go. Sometimes it's a parent. And here in the US, actually, if you petition your parents, they can actually get their papers in a year, which is so much more quicker than, for example, if you petition um your brother or sister. The waiting period for brother or sister usually takes 20 years, 20, decades. People wait, and they usually get, their petition papers when they're old. So, sometimes they don't even want to leave anymore. But I think there's something temporarily going on there where the state is playing with that. So in my past work, I've thought about it through care labor, actually, right? Like when you get your grandparents to come here, usually a lot of them are enlisted to take care of kin. And then maybe it's also their desire to take care of kin. But after pag tumanda na yung mga bata, they're like, oh, I'm gonna go home now to the Philippines. Like, they've done their part, they got to the US. But I think that question is still something that I'm really actually actively thinking about, specifically in how older folks, once they move here, are actually thinking about aging, especially after the pandemic, being in a different place.
Very, very interesting. In New Zealand too, by the way, they had that rule about last relative, and it's interesting the way you mentioned that it seems like it's much quicker to petition or bring someone who's a bit older back to the US or back to this global north spaces much more than the younger ones, because the younger ones may have, even if they can be deployed for labor, it seems like the aging population is looked upon with leniency. There is a comment from Thea, or she said it's actually part of the Philippine tourism and investment strategy to attract aging foreigners to relocate in the Philippines. PRA is one of the attached agencies of the Department of Tourism, and it's under the supervision of the Department of
Yeah.
Tourism. Yeah. So
I actually,
there is an infrastructure too, I guess.
yeah, I have I have a folder here of my documents that I've gathered while I was in the Philippines. I went to a travel expo, a local travel expo, and interestingly enough, PRA was there. So I got some of their promotional materials, but I'm blurry, but there's a ticket here. It looks like a boarding pass. It says name retiree, destination Philippines, arrival today. But on the top it says your ticket to a great life. And when I got here, I was like, oh my God, like when I saw this, I was like, this is so, it's so insidious in a way, as to see this being advertised. And I said it, I was like, oh, I'm getting it from my parents. But yeah, I've been looking at this, and it's just so interesting that it's such a big part of their strategy, to make money. And I think, and then the interplay between diaspora and foreigners is also something that other folks have thought about as well. Or even the diaspora, Filipino, how do I say it? Like Filipino Americans versus OFWs, they have such a different way of dealing with them. Where, for example, and this is something that I'm exploring in my work right now, I'm very interested in the overseas Filipino, the OFW hospital that they started in San Fernando, Pampanga, which seems to be as not as operational as they claim to be. But I think it's such a great way for people to be like, when you come back, we will take care of you. But the only way that you can access these hospitals are actually if you're an OFW or if your family member is an OFW, which just replicates the system of having to out-migrate to actually, to quote unquote, receive adequate care. But the strategies for Filipino Americans like me and my family is in the guise of investment. You can come back, and even the ways that we think and segment Filipinos globally is already different because of the state.
Interesting, no? How that's waxed together into a language that sometimes hides something, at the same time presents something attractive to others. My kind of I wouldn't call them foster parents, but the family that took care of me when I was studying in the US. I visited them early this year, in April, and they were aging, and one is a nurse at Duke University, and so at some point I did ask them a question about where they wanted to be, they actually said me and your tita wanted to go back to the Philippines. Actually, then our only son had a daughter, and we just feel like we have to be there for her, and so we're just gonna be basically um to see her grow. So that's
Mm.
the reason for staying there. But there was this, they were really asking questions about if they can still come back to the Philippines and what do I think about them relocating and all that. But of course, it's not gonna happen anymore because of of uh, of their extended family. And my
Yeah.
own aunt did not quite like her life there in California because she feels like she's just being used by my cousins as a caretaker for their kids. And so she
Yeah.
wants to have, she wants to age gracefully, I'm guessing, but not
Yeah.
to be confined to taking care of her
Uh,
grandchildren. But that's another narrative. It's just a specific narrative. Um, Edward, I was wondering if you could also leave behind your email in case there are people who might be
of
reaching
course.
out to you. If you can just type it in the chat box if there are some questions, because obviously this is something that needs further reflection. Okay, thank you. Uh, and there might be some questions that may arise from it, and we're excited to see how this research of yours will develop and how it will become. It will definitely enrich us when we read aging studies also, and hopefully this becomes a book that will
Yeah.
become available.
Here's to hoping.
Yeah.
This a part of this is actually on the works right now. It's under review for an anthology, maybe in a year or two.
Mhm.
And I will let you all know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I'm also gonna be in Manila, and and Joseph knows this. I'm in Manila for for a little bit. So if anybody, I'd love to connect with
Yeah.
anyone. I'm
And you're gonna come to the Department of Geography after your stint ends
Yes,
at
yeah,
Third
yes.
World,
We
right?
talked
Yeah.
about, yes, a stint in geography after the Third World Studies Center. So
Right.
it would be great to be in community with folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a quick one. So you're gonna be spending the holidays there in the States, right?
Oh no, I'm actually leaving in 2 days. I'm going back to the
Oh,
Philippines.
okay. Well, let's be in touch because I got something to tell you about this. Sorry, totally different.
Mhm.
I'll be in touch with you. But anyway, thank you very much, Edward, for sharing with us your research. Really, really interesting, and we would like to know more about this for sure. And I hope something printed will come out in the near future on this. At this point, we would. This is the part where I will uh, thank everyone for this discussion, and I would like to present a certificate of appreciation to Edward. The certificate of appreciation is given to Edward Nadurata for the valuable insights and expertise shared as virtual speaker for the talk Racial Capitalism Care in the Global Filipino Condition, Interrogating Risk and Contagion in the Philippines and its Diaspora during COVID-19 as part of the Geo Lecture Series of 2023, the last for this year, held on this December 6, 2023. So it's kind of advanced for you, huh? It's still December 5. Oh no, it's already December 6th. Okay, yeah. Signed by yours truly, Joseph Ali's chair of the Department of Geography, and Emmanuel B. Garcia, the president of the Philippine Geographical Society. So I'll send this to you via email, Edward.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Um,
everyone.
yeah, yes. Just a few announcements before we finally formally conclude this lecture series. One is coming up. We have a talk that's coming up in January 2024. Rai Tipay, a graphic designer from Salikhain Collective, will talk about a very interesting topic on art. It's called Dito sa Amin, Watercolor Illustration of Common Public Spaces Used as Landmarks and Reference Points. And although we're not promising anything at this point, but we're trying to see if there will be an exhibit, not a virtual exhibit, but an actual exhibit that will also develop from this talk. And yes, I'll get to that in a second. Okay. Lastly, our past lectures are all stored in the UP Department of Geography YouTube channel. You can visit our channel to watch our previous lectures as well as the recorded events of the Philippine Geographical Society in the Department of Geography.